welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride, and I'm joined today or remotely by Andrew Wilson from the All Under One Banner organisation. Andrew, how are you doing today?
Kenny, good afternoon. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm not bad. We only have the one guest today because, of course, a great many of the people that we might normally have had on the show are all busy with the SNP conference. So we just have Andrew today, but I'm sure that's more than enough. So we start, as we always do, with our coronavirus update. So these statistics are as of 2 p.m. yesterday. 788 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland, and sadly 44 new reported deaths. So the total is now 1,170,888 people in Scotland have been tested. There were 1,076,945 tests confirmed negative. 93,943 were positive. There were 1,077 people in hospital on, Friday night, 77 of whom were in intensive care. And that takes the total number of deaths in Scotland of people who have tested positive to 3,720. So that's the numbers as of 2 p.m. on Saturday. Today's figures obviously will be published at 2 p.m. today. But our first story today, the Rosanna Cunningham, the Environment and Climate Change Secretary, has announced that Scotland will publish an NDC, a nationally determined contribution, ahead of next year's COP26 climate summit here in Glasgow. An NDC is a function of the Paris Agreement. This is what countries do to tell the UN what they're going to do to reduce their emissions. And obviously Scotland, even though it's not a country, if we are to become independent at some time soon, this is one of the things we would want to do quite quickly. So Andrew, what do you make of this announcement from Rosanna Cunningham today? Yesterday, rather.
Well, Kenny, I think it's an important indication. It's another important indication from the Scottish Government of their commitment to both the principles and the detail of the Paris Agreement. It's a demonstration that the Scottish Government continues to wish to be at the front of making a difference and of beginning to address the climate crisis that we're suffering from and will continue to suffer from. I think it shows commitment and seriousness and a determination to do the right thing, and it also helps to demonstrate that in an independent Scotland, things such the seriousness of the climate crisis would likely be taken more seriously than it is by the Westminster government at the moment.
Now, there's obviously there's things that the Scottish Government can do, things that it can't do. How big a limit do you think the Union is on Scotland's climate ambitions, given that we're not seeing perhaps quite the same ambition in Westminster just now?
Yes, Kenny, I think it's instructive that the minimal discussions of climate change and steps to address climate change that were the brief discussions that there were in Westminster that were supposed to be part of the Prime Minister's reboot of his administration, but which collapsed, as they so often do with this government, into recrimination and confusion, and events took over. I think that indicates that Westminster's thinking on green matters has always been patchy and incoherent and uncommitted as well. I think the discussion that I saw during the week as part of that reboot of the Johnson administration was the construction of 6 new small nuclear power stations, which is something which personally I find astonishing. And so I think it's pretty clear that in its confused and partial thinking and planning, Westminster is unable to produce a coherent approach and a coherent plan for addressing the climate change crisis, whereas in Scotland it appears that we take it rather more seriously, and also we have the expertise and the ability to come up with plans that will work and that will make a difference.
And I wonder, the Greens have have commended the Scottish Government's target setting on climate, but obviously have had some criticisms of the delivery. How big a difference do you think it makes having that green presence in Parliament, particularly when the Scottish Government often relies on support from the Greens to get its legislation passed?
That's a very good point, Kenny, and I think as a matter of approach, generally in European countries where the Green parties have had some political success over the years, I think those governments are the better for it, and so I think the in a sense, Scotland is lucky to have a Green Party participating in supporting independence and participating with the Scottish Government. So I think it opens up minds, and it opens up approaches to bring the most up to date thinking right to the top of the stack of policy priorities. And personally, I think we're the better for it.
And what do you make of the kind of criticisms that the Green Party make? I mean, they're always pushing for more progressive policies and more kind of carbon negative policies. But what do you make of the criticisms that they have of the Scottish Government that these targets are perhaps out of reach given what the Scottish Government is actually willing to do?
I suppose it's a question of what the Scottish Government is willing to do and is able to do, and I mean that both in constitutional terms, legal terms, but also in terms of the politics of the situation. The decarbonisation of the North Sea industry will be a significant challenge for Scotland, but it's something that the Scottish Government have said that they will do. And so the albeit that there isn't a plan yet, there is a commitment to that plan. So I think it's helpful to have the Green Party continuing to test and argue and review and make changes, or make proposals for changes. I think that helps keep the Scottish Government honest, and it's part of the ongoing. It's part of normal politics in an independent country, and so I think it's to be commended and encouraged, and I think it should continue.
Well, we will obviously keep an eye on that as we look forward to the COP26, which is just about a year away now, all being well with people being allowed to travel by then. We will obviously keep looking at that as we go on, but we move on a wee bit now to look at a couple of stories came up this week. Firstly, that Akshata Murthy, the wife of Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, her interests of up to £430 million are not listed in Rishi Sunak's register of ministerial interests. Normally, it is close family, including siblings, spouses, in-laws, and parents, all need to be declared because obviously those would have an interest. You would have an interest in what happens to those very close family members. Murty's father founded Infosys, the information technology company, which is worth billions. And for some reason, the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner did not have a problem with this. Alec Allen, the gentleman who resigned last week over Priti Patel being kept in post, was the person who advised that this was okay. So this story came up, and then we've got another story we'll speak to in a minute. But Andrew, I think first of all, what do you think the effect of that kind of wealth has on somebody who's then got to make decisions about where money gets allocated to people who need it in the country?
Well, I think Kenny, without having a go at the Chancellor of the Exchequer personally, I think as a general proposition, the extent of his and his family's wealth is such that he would encounter considerable difficulty in understanding the priorities and the concerns and the wishes of people who might otherwise be described as ordinary citizens. That's not to say that they're not extraordinary citizens. It's just they're not as wealthy as Mr. Sunak and his father-in-law. So I think politicians who are in positions of power, but who have such spectacular personal wealth, are almost guaranteed to be dislocated from the experience of the population at large. And as a result, I wonder what the priorities and the approaches of people such as him are in comparison to the rest of us.
Mm. Now, the other story that came up, this one I think is from today, and this is a gentleman by the name of, where's his name now? I've lost it, I'm sorry. But he's the chief executive of NHS X, which was supposed to drive the NHS, I think specifically in England, forward digitally. And this gentleman, he's been in post temporarily for over a year now. And he is an old school friend of George Osborne's, who then kind of rose up the ranks of the civil service very quickly over the last 10 years. Now, we've seen a lot of cases recently of people being, for example, in the procurement process for COVID, people being referred into the system and then getting into this special channel that let them bid for things or get contracts without bidding. I wonder what you make of this kind of chumocracy that's developing, where the Tories in government now seem to be more willing than ever, or more brazen than ever at least, about giving contracts to their friends and family.
It's a good point, Kenny, and I was reflecting on it this morning. There have been a couple of books written in the US recently, and in the UK, talking about the similarities between the Trump administration and the Johnson administration. Now, I think it's tolerably clear that one of the key aspects of the Trump administration is about the president making money himself. Well, the president and his family making money as a result of his status as president. And I think the circumstances that you're describing are another perfect example of how the Johnson administration is behaving in the same manner as Trump has done in the past. And so friends and family being enriched at the public purse without public procurement procedures being followed in any way at all. And I appreciate that it was a pandemic, and I appreciate that the Westminster government had run down needlessly the stockpiles of PPE before the pandemic arose. But that the emergency that we found ourselves in, which was exacerbated by the lack of planning and preparation on the part of the Westminster government, does not in and of itself mean that all controls and checks and balances to prevent the self-enrichment by the political class, there was no justification for that to be thrown out the window completely. And so I think, in addition to comparing Johnson and Trump, I think there is now clearly a comparison between Johnson and the dying days of the John Major's administration. My own perception, and I was a younger man at the time, but my recollection of my perception is that administration gradually sank into a morass, into a mire of corruption and deceit, and MPs going to jail, and just generally it lost any possible authority in the country, largely as a result of the corrupt and ridiculous behaviour of cabinet ministers and the party generally. And I wonder if, notwithstanding the additional brazenness of it, I think notwithstanding the additional brazenness we see now, I think there's a colourable argument that the Johnson administration is now sinking as fast as John Major's second administration did. And that's as a result of the corruption that we're seeing every day.
Mm. Of course, the big difference there is that John Major had a wafer-thin majority that eventually got whittled away. Boris Johnson still has 80 seats in his favour. I wonder, though, that one of the other differences there is that during the Major government, I mean, I was relatively young then as well, but we did at least see ministers resign when they were caught in these scandals. Whereas this government, we've seen, for example, Alec Allen, the advisor on standards, resign after his report into Priti Patel's bullying was ignored. We've seen the very strong support given to Dominic Cummings, getting to give his press conference in the garden at Number 10 to defend himself over a clear breach of lockdown rules. What do you make of a system where we can't even see ministers resign in shame. We've even seen, we've seen law officers resign because of the government being unwilling to obey international law, but we're not seeing them resign when they break the law or break the ministerial code. What do we do about a democracy where those kind of basic standards aren't being met?
Well, certainly, Kenny. I think there's a definite similarity again between the Trump administration and Johnson. The willingness to disregard norms and expectations and established practices of public behaviour are are disappointing, but are also a significant threat to our democracy. If we know in the United States that the process of oversight of government departments was introduced largely as a result of Nixon's maladministration and his corruption. I think superintendents general, I think they're called, and so we saw that the American system had to be significantly reformed after Nixon, and it was, but Trump began to whittle that away by sacking repeated superintendents general and not appointing replacements properly. And I think in the UK, what we may end up finding is that we will need to follow the American approach, follow after Nixon, and introduce greater oversight, greater control, more formal processes to prevent the kind of self enrichment and disrespect to the population that we see from the current administration. I know perfectly well, and in my line of work, that if anyone, heaven forfend, if anyone had accused me of bullying and the bullying had been found to have taken place, I would have been sacked. And I don't see why it's any different for Priti Patel. And if I was found to have been handing contracts at work to my friends and family, I would have been sacked. And I don't see why it should be any different for Matt Hancock or the rest of the Westminster cabinet.
Hmm. Now, you draw a comparison with the Trump administration in the States, but obviously there are differences because obviously in the US there are term limits. Even if Trump had won this election, 8 years is the most he could serve. As it is, it's only four. Joe Biden comes in, presumably starts to clean some of this stuff up. I mean, I doubt he'll clean up everything, but completely drain the swamp. But the Tories, most observers right now are not going to be surprised if we have another 10 years of Tory government, at least another two terms, which would be 20 years of this government, of these Tories. How much, and of course we don't have the backup of a written constitution like in the US. How much damage do you think that can be done to standards in public life if this kind of behaviour continues for another 10 years?
Well, it's a good question, Kenny. I suspect that I think it's unlikely that we would find ourselves with 20 years. So the United Kingdom would find itself with 20 years of a Tory government. Simply again because of events, dear boy, events, and I'll not swear as I think Macmillan actually did. The inevitably, or not inevitably, our experience is that administrations run out of talent, they run out of energy, they run out of roads in the minds of the voters because they have not delivered on what they had promised, and or events overtake. So what I may be clutching a comfort blanket to myself with the notion that we wouldn't have a Tory administration for 20 years, which of course the people of Scotland have never voted, haven't voted for this century, and haven't voted for in a majority for 70 years. On the one hand, I cling to that comfort blanket that the electorate will run out of patience with a Tory government, as they did with a Labour government, as they did with Tony Blair. So that is a slight protection, but as you say, it's not a structural protection, and and it doesn't give us any real confidence. However, I think that whilst we've seen attempts by Trump to, if you will, cement or lock in some of the terrible things that he's been doing, those attempts I think will will be subject to being overturned if necessary in the Supreme Court, and I know that's a whole challenge as well. If we are seeing the way in which the Supreme Court Justice Barrett is starting to write opinions, I think the opinion that came out this week is starting to suggest to legal analysts in the United States that she will be at least as fundamentalist right-wing Christian as is feared, if not more so. That's their concern. For us, I think on the one hand, one would say that the checks and balances that, for example, the civil service provided and tries to continue to provide, they will persist longer than any politician. However, we can see that the ambition of this particular Tory administration is almost unlimited. We've heard Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that he wants to demolish Holyrood and remove all of the, and by implication, remove all of the improvements and modernisation that was introduced with the Supreme Court, with the human rights legislation, and with devolution. He wants to demolish all of that. And so it's clear that the current government have an ambition to do so. But I wonder whether they have the ability and the time to get away with that. We can see that with Cummings departing, I think a lot of the intellectual energy will begin to dissipate from Downing Street, and I take some comfort in that. And I think we'll see the Westminster administration struggle, not least because they struggled through COVID. They are really going to struggle with Brexit. So I think it's as likely that we'll see significant change next year, and that may sweep away some of the threats that the Tories now present.
Well, we will obviously keep watching on all of those questions, but we move on now and we come back to Scotland, where on Monday an inquiry into the events surrounding the death of Sheikh Ubayo will begin. Sheikh Ubayo, as many of you will remember, a 32-year-old black man, died in police custody in May of 2015 in Kirkcaldy. There have long been questions about the police's actions. His family and his lawyer, Amar Anwar, have continually alleged that the police brutality was a result of racism. And this has taken a long time to come to this stage. So this inquiry, led by Lord Bracadale, starting on Monday. Andrew, first of all, what's wrong with us when this kind of inquiry takes 5 years to come to fruition?
Well, it's an interesting question, Kenny. I'm reminded that this weekend is the anniversary of the crash of the helicopter into the Clutha Bar in Glasgow, and the fatal accident inquiry for that took a very long time. I'm also reminded that the litigation associated with the loss of Piper Alpha that took more than 10 years to complete, although the inquiry was in the middle of that 10-year period. I think there are challenges always. On the one hand, a rush to justice doesn't help, to be honest, in my opinion. However, families and the rest and society generally require some confidence that in circumstances where something terrible has happened, and the death in custody of anybody is terrible, a death in custody of Sheikh Ubayo in custody is terrible. In circumstances where there have been terrible events, we need to understand what happened, and we need to be able to take steps to prevent them happening again. And we need to do that we need to do that in a timescale that makes sense to everybody. So I'm not suggesting that there should have been a public inquiry established as soon as it became tolerably clear what had happened in this case or any other case. However, a greater sense of urgency and a greater sense of determination to get to the truth and to get to the bottom of what has happened, I think is important for public confidence, if nothing else. And so my great preference would have been that the Bayo family would have had an inquiry and would have had some degree of the closure that an inquiry can bring. It doesn't always bring. I'm very much reminded of the events relating to the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And so inquiries need to be brought forward more quickly than is the case in order that people have confidence in them. But I am minded that large public inquiries are complex. They can consume huge amounts of resources, And that's the right thing to do. That's necessary. But making those arrangements and getting those things configured and set up properly cannot be done overnight. So that's a kind of a lawyer's answer. I'm sorry. I'm saying that yes, we need greater certainty faster, but not a rush to justice.
Well, speaking of great lawyers, Ailish Angelini just recently published a report into the way that Police Scotland handle complaints and criticism, and this is not directly related to the Sheku Bio case, but certainly has implications for it. She commented that there was still a lot of racism in the police force in Scotland. Also criticised a lack of accountability and lack of good procedures for managing incidents where people are complaining about police behaviour, like, for example, not separating witnesses. I also saw a quote while reading about this that said that no police officer in Britain has ever been prosecuted for manslaughter, or obviously it would be culpable homicide here, even where there's evidence of unlawful or excessive use of force or of gross neglect. We've seen all over the elsewhere in the world, for example, in the US with the Black Lives Matter movement, does seem to be this systemic problem in a lot of police forces of not being able to respond to criticism, especially after events like you mentioned, the death of Stephen Lawrence, where the police failed badly. And then cases like Sheku Bio or some of these cases we've seen in the US. Do you think there is a way that we can quickly get racism out of the police? Is there some kind of mechanism we can do to filter out these people, or is there some kind of deeper cultural change that needs to happen, do you think?
My own opinion would be that there is probably deeper cultural change required, and I would say that in my opinion, deeper cultural change is required in our society as a whole. I think in this respect, in some ways, the security services and the police are a microcosm of the society in which we all live. I'm very aware that as a middle class, middle aged, single white Protestant male, I'm not representative of modern Scotland at all, and so I'm always mindful when talking about these things that someone like me should be listening rather than talking. However, I think we know, and I'm not being glib about it. If we of any understanding that we have of the way in which the police handle and respond to complaints, in terms of the dramatisation of the approaches that the police take, that we all watch on our TV screens of an evening, if that is in any way reflective of what happens, we can see that and I can understand why, in some senses, the police have a defensive approach to these things, not a siege mentality completely, but that they are suspicious of the damage to the reputation and the damage to their authority, which protracted or deep public inquiries which expose wrongdoing by the police. And I include both criminal wrongdoing and racism and sexism and sectarianism, all of those things which are present in our society. But the Police Scotland seem, for some reason, to struggle to address those concerns in a constructive way. Now, it may simply be that, as we know, the representation of ethnic minorities in Police Scotland is too low. Ethnic minorities are underrepresented in the ranks of Police Scotland at the moment. I'm sure it's changing and it's improving, but it's only changing and improving very slowly. And that causes me to reflect a little bit as well. Certainly there was research in the United States that showed that the motivations of people who wanted to serve in the police forces was very different across different ethnic backgrounds. Often, those with a white background saw the police as a good career and a good pension, whereas other ethnic groups saw the police as a way of serving the community and returning to the community the energies and good work. So I think we need more understanding. We need better processes and approaches in the police more generally, and it's not just Police Scotland I'm talking about. We need to be swifter to get to conclusions in order that there is confidence And in order that frankly, even at a basic level, in order that the evidence that is gathered is of a better quality, if you wait 5 years before you start taking evidence, that evidence will at the very least have been damaged by the passage of time. A greater determination to move at a faster pace to get to the bottom of problems and to address them is necessary. I'm bound to say, in my own dealings with Police Scotland over the last couple of years, they have been nothing but not hugely supportive of the people of Scotland generally. In my own conversations with individual police officers who are not promoted, their commitment to acting on behalf of and defending the people of Scotland has always been very strong, in my experience. However, things go wrong, bad decisions may be taken in circumstances, or officers may act in a manner that is not defensible. So we need to be able to strengthen the resolve in Police Scotland to act in a manner which all of us would wish them to do, and that includes being accepting of criticism when that criticism is justified and acting on it to make sure that whatever it was being criticised doesn't happen again.
Now, tying in a wee bit to what we were talking about with the Johnson government and their kind of defence of people who have done things wrong, I wonder, do you think there is just a cultural change generally that we need, where public bodies find it easier to say, we did something wrong and this is what happened, this is why it happened, and this is how we're going to deal with it, rather than this almost kind of compulsive desire to defend the organization, to cover up, to refuse to answer questions? I mean, we've seen it with lots of public bodies, lots of politicians. I wonder if there's something we need to change in our culture around admitting mistakes.
Well, I think that's right, Kenny. I think as politics has polarized over the last 20 years, and public life has polarized, and also in a sense it brings us back a little bit to the second story we had at the top of the show with regard to how do people such as the Chancellor of the Exchequer and his family relate and interact with the rest of society? Are their morals and priorities and mores, are they the same as the rest of us or not? And so, yes, I think in civic life and in public life, it's true that the hardening of positions and the polarization of so much of our lives has meant that people either feel that they don't need to admit when they made a mistake because it won't have any effect on them, or they just point blank refuse to take responsibility or to admit there's been a problem because they feel that it will be used by their political opponents to destroy them. So I think an approach, the beginning of an approach to a more civically minded way of life, which is something which I think an independent Scotland could bring. I think a greater sense that we are all in this together. We all live in the same society. We affect others in that society in different ways depending on who we are and what we do. But a greater understanding and a sharing of that shared civic nationality and a recognition that we all make mistakes. None of us are perfect, far from it. So that's the case in all ways. And so we need to firstly recognise that. Secondly, be big enough to deal with that, and thirdly, make sure that we learn lessons when mistakes are made.
Well, we turn now to the US. We have already mentioned Donald Trump once or twice during the show, but on Friday, a federal appeal court rejected an attempt by Trump to block Joe Biden from being declared the winner in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, of course, was one of the key states, one that Trump really desperately needed to win if he was going to have any chance of retaining the presidency. He did lose by quite a margin, and the court said that free, fair elections are the lifeblood of our democracy. Charges of unfairness are serious, but calling an election unfair does not make it so. Charges require specific allegations and then proof. We have neither here. Voters, not lawyers, choose the president. Ballots, not briefs, decide elections. Now, obviously, Donald Trump has been fighting very hard to convince people that there is widespread fraud. He's shifted away from Fox News and is now promoting Newsmax and One America News Network, which are, let us say, fake news in large part. They are not entirely honest about the facts of the situation. Now, he has said that he will resign if the Electoral College does pick Joe Biden, as we assume that it will. And he has allowed for the transition process to begin. Joe Biden is now getting security briefings and whatnot. But Donald Trump doesn't seem to be backing down on the courts. We've got his legal team referring to the activist judicial machinery covering up allegations of massive fraud. What do you think the outcome is here? If Donald Trump keeps this narrative going, can shift people towards news channels that are keeping this narrative going, at what point do we think that those people might start to take action or resist Joe Biden's appointment to the presidency somehow?
Well, I think Kenny, as Trump steps down, as he must, or sorry, as Trump ceases to be president of the United States, I think one thing we will see is that I hope the Republican Party will begin to wake up from the nightmare it's had for the last 4 or 5 years, and that if the Republican Party begins to reform and to act in a manner that we would perhaps expect, then we'll see more of Trump's energy and power begin to dissipate. I can't say for sure, but I would suspect that Trump still believes that the various casinos in Atlantic City that went bankrupt under his management didn't go bankrupt. He will defend and deny till the very, very end. I think it's important to note that for all the huffing and puffing on Twitter, and for all the huffing and puffing in press conferences from the president's legal team, his legal team are not able to allege fraud in any of the litigations that have been raised anywhere. Now that's the case because it's absolutely clear that in any circumstances in the civil courts, if you allege fraud, you must produce very detailed information regarding that alleged fraud immediately. You can't shout about it but not back it up. You need to plead with a significant degree of particularity if you're going to allege fraud. And of course, in the absence of any evidence of fraud, and there is no evidence of fraud, Trump's lawyers have not been able to make those allegations in court because they know that if they did, they would be disbarred and they would lose their income. So they're not doing it. So I think all of the litigation, Trump has not succeeded in any of the litigations that have been raised. The vast majority of them have already been thrown out. It may end up in the Supreme Court potentially. I'm not so sure. But certainly in terms of the allegations that Trump tweets about and sometimes talks about there being voter fraud, there are no allegations being brought in the courts about fraud, and that's because it didn't happen. There's no evidence of it at all. So I think Trump more generally will continue to rail against the dying of the light of his nightmarish administration. I think politics in the United States may return a little bit to normal. Or more normal in terms of the Republican Party beginning to assert itself at the end of the Trump nightmare. But there's no question 70 million people voted for Trump, and so they will need to be brought down in a general sense. I think they will need to be brought down in a careful way. So many of them we see seem to have been marched up to the top of the hill. And they are going to have to be marched down again unless there's going to be difficulty. And I'm hopeful that a very experienced politician like Biden, with a good team behind him, will be able in part to begin to achieve that. And if the Republican Party plays its part as well by reforming its approach and returning to a more normal type of politics, then I think we might see some progress.
Mm. Well, we come back to Scotland now, and as we said, the SNP conference is taking place this weekend, and John Swinney, the Deputy First Minister and the Education Secretary, announced free school meals extension, including breakfast. Just to quote what he said, the callous cuts to welfare imposed by the Conservatives are bad enough, but we now face a tsunami of child poverty if the Tory Chancellor imposes a second wave of austerity. Scotland's children cannot afford that. This is not just an issue for the very poorest. This is an issue for working families forced to feed children from food banks or go hungry themselves. Right now, all P1 to P3 pupils are entitled to free school lunches. Given what I fear we are facing from the Tories, we will not leave a child at the mercy of a Tory Chancellor just because they are in P4, P5, P6 or P7. So, Andrew, what did you make of John Swinney's announcement?
I think it's a shame on us all that we get to a situation in the 21st century where this has to be done. This is inexcusable. However, by inexcusable I mean that as a society we have allowed our society to deteriorate to that extent. However, in terms of addressing the challenges that our society has brought upon ourselves, I think this approach by the Scottish Government is to be commended and is to be supported. I think the everybody understands that children who go hungry struggle to learn and struggle to concentrate. We also know that children who are not being fed properly are the studies in Scotland relating to poverty and food shortages go back to the 1950s. And we still seem not to have learned those. We still seem not to be able to prevent the problems arising in the first place. That the Scottish Government is stepping in to address the problem in this way is probably what's necessary at this time. I say that because we've had an economy that's been flatlining for more than 10 years. I think average household incomes are predicted now to increase by 0.1%, I think, over the next 5 years. It's something like that. The economic performance of the economy is disastrous at the moment. And largely it's working families and the poorest who have been suffering as a result of the astonishingly bad economic performance, following on from the banking crisis, exacerbated by 10 years of unnecessary and dogmatic austerity, and now being hit with, firstly, COVID, where the economy has crashed in a manner that we've never seen before, and we're about to come into Brexit, where the economy is going to get hammered again. So, unfortunately, it is the Scottish Government is going to have to take these steps now, and getting this organised and getting it stood up now is absolutely the right thing to do. I think we're going to see more and more families in significant problems over the next year or two, and there's far too many families in problems already, but it's going to get worse. So, in terms of making sure that children are fed, I think it's the most basic thing as a society that we should be doing, and I'm delighted. I'm disappointed that he's had to do it, but I'm delighted that he's done it. And the Scottish Government gets organised and gets on with this. I think they're estimating £230 million a year this is going to cost, and I think that's money well spent.
I mean, certainly when you factor in things like educational attainment and potentially health outcomes later in life, that cost may well be an excellent investment. I wonder though, as somebody myself who wasn't a great fan of school dinners back in the day, doesn't it make more sense just to increase something like the Scottish Child Payment, maybe extend that to more people, and let parents have the choice of whether to give the Waynes a packed lunch instead of a school dinner?
It's a fair question, Kenny. My own view is that the educational priorities and the life outcome priorities and the health outcomes are of such importance that that at this time, providing the food and not making sure that the children eat it, but making sure that it is there and that children are eating it, I think it's important that we all take a stake in that. I'm not suggesting that the state is telling parents what they should feed their children and when, but I think we're in such a potential crisis situation here that we need to pull together as a society. I think that reflecting on, for example, I'm thinking of the changes that are said to have happened in Finland when the baby box was introduced. Very quickly, it became apparent that the whole of Finnish society participated in that approach, and so across classes and backgrounds and geographies in Finland, one aspect of the baby box was that it unified the population. So depending on what time of year it was that your child was born, all the children got the same T-shirt, for the sake of argument, in the baby box. And so parents and society could see literally in front of them that all these children were born at the same time in Finland, because they were wearing the same T-shirt. It's a daft example, but it is certainly suggested that the shared experience of the baby box in Finland helped build a cohesive and caring society there, where it was recognised that everybody had a stake in the well-being and welfare of our young people. And I wonder if we can get to a place where it is accepted that children will be fed, will get breakfast, but they will get it at school. I think that change in our society may not necessarily be a bad thing. I completely agree that we ought to be in a position to do it in a more flexible way and to make sure that parents are not being sidelined in the upbringing of their children in that narrow respect. But I think in terms of the benefits that it can bring, I think making sure that everybody is fed and everybody is fed together, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I do think that school dinners have improved since the time that I was in school, and then that later more recently than that when you were in school.
Well, speaking of building a different kind of society, as we said, the SNP conference is this weekend. There's been a lot going on in the world of independence politics. We saw, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg at the end of the week there talking about devolution being a mistake. One of talking about Tony Blair's constitutional tinkering and saying that needed to be undone. The constitution, the proper constitution of the UK, needed to be restored. But then we've seen Duncan McLennan, a former senior advisor to Donald Dewar, Henry McLeish and Jack McConnell, the three Labour First Ministers of Scotland. He has said that he's now supporting independence in what was quite a surprise to some people. And then, of course, we've seen Keith Brown making a speech at the conference talking about new ways of campaigning and certainly gearing people up for a future referendum. The First Minister has now said it will be in the early part of the next Parliament. So from the point of view of All Under One Banner and the work that they've been doing to build up this Yes Alba organisation, what have you taken from what you've seen in the last few days?
Well, certainly the first point you make there, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg is the Member of Parliament for the 17th century, talking about constitutional tinkering. It just shows how out of touch the man is, and it just shows how dangerous he is. I strongly believe that the constitutional reforms and updates that were delivered under the Blair administrations, in terms of human rights law, in terms of the establishment of the Supreme Court, in terms of sorting out the mess that the House of Lords, beginning to sort out the mess that the House of Lords was, in particular its role in its judicial function, and the focus on devolution, devolving everything that could be devolved, were all necessary modernisations of a constitution in the UK that was, one, unwritten, and two, fundamentally based in the 17th century and times before that. So I think Rees-Mogg is perhaps also howling at the dying of the light, because he knows that that in a modern democracy, the kind of things that he's talking about, attempting to roll back, are fundamental parts of our modern democracy. So it's not going to wash. He can shout about it all he wants. It's not going to happen. More generally, I think we are certainly seeing in Scotland an increased discussion about the imminent probability of there being an independence referendum in 2021. I think if there is not an independence referendum in 2021, a great many people will be very disappointed. So I think we're certainly seeing a determination in a number of fronts to organise and begin to prepare for all of the work that will need to be done in the context of a referendum, in the context of securing a referendum and then winning a referendum, the two steps that we need to take. So we're seeing the national the Yes groups beginning to organise into a national Yes network, and that is a very important organisation across the Yes groups, bringing them together and unifying them into regions, and then a national organisation to support networking and communication between those groups. We're seeing Voices for Scotland. Their campaigns, I believe, are just about to be launched with regard to doorstep campaigning and conversations amongst the population and supporting those conversations. And all in under one banner has taken the step of providing a platform for individual members and yes groups to have a conversation amongst themselves about what they would like to see in terms of a national membership organisation. So those conversations went very well and were very constructive. And so it was decided by those who were meeting together that they wished a national membership organisation to be established. And so All Under One Banner then took the step to provide a platform for nominations to a committee who will establish that national membership organisation. We facilitated the nominations for those who wished to stand. The meeting decided that there would be 15 people on that committee, and 45 people have indicated that they would like to be on the committee, and that's a fantastic vote of confidence in the plans and in the expectations. The elections are taking place amongst those who participated in the meetings. The elections are taking place just now, and I anticipate that we will have a national committee, an inaugural national committee established very soon. Now, this is not to form a political party. This is not to get in the way of the other organisations that are already established in Scotland to campaign for independence or to support the campaign for independence. This is to establish an organisation which individuals can join, and they can use that joining together as a way of demonstrating their wish for independence in Scotland and their wish to participate directly in winning that independence. So this organisation will be a campaigning organisation. It will provide a means to mobilise members very quickly. It will also provide a voice for members very easily. It is not intended to be beset by committees and lengthy, protracted discussions of policy matters. It is intended to be a campaigning organisation in support of independence in Scotland, no matter your party political views. And so that, I think it is another example of the appetite for another referendum and the appetite to win a second referendum that there is in Scotland, and the determination of those who already support it to make sure that we continue to grow support for those positions and that we are successful in a second referendum.
Now, I had an interesting discussion with Pete Wishart on Scotland at 7 on Friday. He seems very confident that Boris Johnson will agree to a referendum if the SNP get a majority result in May. But when you hear things like Boris Johnson talking about what a disaster devolution has been, and then Jacob Rees-Mogg saying that it needs to be undone, does that, I mean, it clearly isn't a very good strategic move in winning back support in Scotland, but I wonder what you think it says about the likelihood of that agreement coming quite easily.
Well, it's an interesting question, Kenny. I'm reminded that Rory